All right, now let's talk about experimental and ethical issues and wrap this chapter up for the week. All right, so experimental method is a method that the researcher used to determine the answer questions about cause and effect. All right, in an experiment, the volunteer is going to receive a treatment, and the researchers are going to monitor the volunteer to determine how the treatment influences their behavior. Limits. All right, conditions in the experiment may not accurately reflect real life. Why? Because experiments have to be simplified in order to determine cause and effect. Even though there are limits, experiments still yield very useful information to researchers. Right? There are variables in experimentation. Variables are factors that can vary or change. There are two variables that are very important to research: the independent variable and the dependent variable. The independent variable is the factor that the researcher manipulates so they can determine its effect. Example, high temperatures in the environment make people aggressive. The temperature is the independent variable in this scenario. And the dependent variable is going to be the level of aggression. A dependent variable, on the other hand, is the factor measured that may be or that may change as a result of the manipulation of the independent variable. So the dependent variable is the factor measured that may be changed as a result of the manipulation of the independent variable. You have two types of groups in an experiment: an experimental group and a control group. An experimental group receives the treatment. A control group receives no treatment. All conditions are held constant for both groups. This allows the researcher to determine that experiments' results are caused by the treatments and not something else. And when experiments use an experimental and control group, it's called a controlled experiment. There's also what's called a placebo effect in the control group. Research studies, our expectations affect what's going to happen to us. And this is where the placebo effect comes in. A placebo is a substance or treatment that has no effect apart from a person's belief in its effectiveness. Or an example of this would be someone's given a pill that looks like a Tylenol for their headache, but really it's just a tablet with no medicine. They take the tablet and their head begins to feel better, even though there was no medicine in the tablet. This person's expectation of what that drug was going to do for them affected how they felt. That's called the placebo effect. Placebo effect can be felt if you're on a clinical trial for a medication. Okay. It was in the news the other day. A doctor was in a clinical trial for the coronavirus vaccine. He believed that he had the vaccine. He was treating his patients. He believed that he was protected because he had the vaccine. So he began to just go on his life as normal. Come to find out at the end of the study, he truly did not have the vaccine. So his expectation that he had the vaccine influenced his behavior, how he acted, what he did, what he went out and did with his friends, what he did with his patients, how close he came in contact with his patients with coronavirus, and so on. So that is the placebo effect. Next, we have a blind study. This is a way to avoid influence of expectations by keeping the participants unaware or blind to the treatments they are receiving. In this type of study, the researcher and the experiment organizer are aware of the treatment given, but the participant is not. So that doctor, he was actually a part of what the FDA requires, which is a double-blind study. In this double-blind study, the researcher nor the participant are aware of who actually has the drug and who has the placebo. Only the experiment organizer knows who has the drug and who has the placebo. And the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, requires a double-blind study before a drug can be sold to the general public. People who measure effects in double-blind studies can remain unbiased. After measurements are made, an impartial panel determines the effectiveness of the drug by determining if the effects of the drug are different from the effects of the placebo. Did we see a vast difference in the people who actually had the vaccine and the people who didn't? That's how they would determine if it was effective. All right, central tendency and dispersion. This is where we get into some analyzing of the data. So once the researchers gather the data, they organize it to generalize it to the general public. They measure the central tendency, which is the number that describes the average score of distribution. They also find the central tendency by finding the median or middle score and the mode or most frequent score. You have some measures of variability, like the range is the highest score in the data subtracted from the lowest score, and the standard deviation is a measure of the distance of every score to the mean or the middle, right? And so the larger the standard deviation, the more spread out the scores are. Um, Ethics. This is another thing that's very important to psychologists. Ethics are standards for proper and responsible behavior. They use ethics to promote the dignity of the individual in the study, foster human welfare, and maintain scientific integrity. The goal of psychology as a whole is to lessen human suffering. So, ethical standards prevent scientists from undertaking research or treatment that would be harmful to human participants. And the American Psychological Association has specific ethical guidelines. Let's start with research in people. Ethical standards limit the type of research psychologists can conduct. Example, a psychologist would not intentionally separate infants from their mother to determine if it impaired the child's social, mental, or cognitive development. An alternative to this would be that a psychologist could look at children already separated, from their mother and observe their development. However, you could not, or a researcher could not make specific conclusions um, because the factor leading to the separation could have a different effect on the child. Like, did the parents die? Was the child abandoned? Um, was the child taken due to the parents having addiction issues? So, those three scenarios are three very different scenarios and affect children in very different ways. Um, what is needed to make a study ethical? Well, first and foremost, you have to have confidentiality. The record of the participant or clients has to be kept private. People are more likely to be honest when they know what they say is just between them and the researcher. And confidentiality can be thrown out the window if it's thought that someone is going to hurt themselves or others. Also, a study is ethical when the participant has informed consent. People have to agree to or consent to participate in a research study. And only after they've been given an overview of what's going to be conducted. This gives the participant control and makes it less stressful for them. Um, Another thing is deception. In order for some studies to be valid, some participants have to be deceived. For example, the placebo takers. Participants will get an explanation once the study is over, and this helps to avoid misunderstandings and maintains the dignity of the participant and reduces their anxiety. Also, ethics in the using of the data. The researchers have to be objective in the research process from the beginning. They have to be ethical in how they produce, use, and store the data. And they have to be willing to discard their hypothesis if it proves to be inaccurate. Um, Also, finally, what we're going to talk about is research with animals. Sometimes research on animals may be harmful to them. These types of studies would be unethical on humans, like that separating a mother from her child. Sometimes psychologists will separate a baby chimp from his or her mother in order to research the bonds of attachment. Also, psychologists destroy some parts of the brains in animals to learn how those parts influence other parts and the behavior of the animal and how that can be applied to human behavior. Studies like these have made advancements in the treatment of mental disorders, strokes, visual and memory defects, headaches, and high blood pressure in humans. However, the ethicalness of using animals in scientific research has often been debated. This is where you're going to give me your opinion. I want you to think about this slide in particular. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think it's ethical or unethical to utilize animals for study, for scientific research and scientific study? If you agree, I want you to tell me why. And if you disagree, I want you to tell me why. Use evidence to support your stance. Okay, I hope you guys enjoyed. Have a great one.